dive with Brady, aka War Hamster. How are you today?
I am walking on clouds the last couple of days. I bet you can't guess why.
I don't know. Was there a special event here in the last day or so?
Yeah. There's a thing called I guess the most important election in history. Well, I tell you, it has been so much fun watching the talking heads just melt down. I put it out on Twitter yesterday. Um, sorry, X. I guess now that Elon's joined the good guys side, he can rename his website. I put it out there. The graph that shows that I don't know, 20 million votes from 2020 just existed, just flashed out of existence. Where are those 20 million people? But I asked people why they think the difference was, and the answers I got over and over and over again was America's just too anti female. We're just not ready to have a woman president. And my response is good. Keep thinking that way because you completely are missing the beat of what just happened. That popular vote, which absolutely means nothing, but to see a runaway like that, despite all of the experts' predictions, tells you, we were right about what the pulse on the ground is, and we don't care about this woke garbage. We want it out of our lives. We care about more important things, and more of the American electorate believes that, and they're missing that plot. They're doubling down on the wokeness.
And I do think it's interesting that 2024 put 2020 in the spotlight. So you have the data of 2016, like supposedly on that numbers chart on the bar graph, you have 2020 up here as like some beacon of, massive turnouts. Now there's spotlights from 2016 and 2024 shining on it going, what the heck just happened there?
You want me to pull up that graph? I've got it handy. Give me 1 second. The other thing, the really interesting data point that comes out of this is the entire nation swung 8 percentage points from 2020, but the swing states only swung 3 or 4 points. Now, what logical explanation do we have for that? I've got some thoughts, but a lot of it's where the
Share it with
resources.
us.
Yeah, it's where the resources went. Um, Obviously, the swing states are where the Democrats put all their money, and we put an awful lot of brand new grassroots efforts into it. That's where we're going to see any ballot harvesting of that stuff. They put all their efforts into the swing states, and apparently it worked to some degree. But it's like the expression of too big to rig. That's what came into play here. We didn't just win. We didn't win in the swing states. We won across the country on the national popular vote. And we did enough of that we won the most important swing states. And I think that really matters. So let's see how this screen share works on Rumble Studios, if I can show you that magic chart.
Yeah, I don't know how that works.
It's not giving me an option of what I want to share. So let me try this one more time. You may have to give me permission because it's not even giving me anything at all.
Let me see. It says, well, it just gives me my screen on sharing my tabs that I have open on my computer.
Well, let me just shoot this graph over to
It
you.
says also share tab audio, so I don't know.
Yeah, when I hit the share screen, nothing happens. So I don't have permissions. I guess you have to be some kind of
Manage participants. Let me see here.
If not, I just texted you the graph if you want to pull it up. But let's try to figure this out since it's our first time using Rumble Studio.
Let's see. Yeah, I don't. There's little dots beside you that has mute, permanent mute, but it doesn't give me like permissions to grant. So I don't know.
Well, see if you can pull it up from the text, because I think it's a fascinating chart. I think it tells more about the election than anything else. If you're trying to do that, the other huge takeaway I thought was it was Generation X that won the election. There's 4 major demographic groups, and the 45 to 64 were 6 points in favor of Trump, and all the other 3 demographics voted for Kamala. So it was Gen X, and the explanation for that matches up with what I said earlier. Gen X, which I'm proud to be part of, even though we're a smaller demographic generation than the baby boomers or millennials, we grew up in the 80s and 90s, which is arguably the least racist period in American history. That's nonsense didn't happen in the 80s and 90s. And so, the Gen X generation, all this woke stuff doesn't work on us. We don't have this guilt, feeling of guilt. That isn't, what we grew up being. That stuff didn't come back into popularity until the 2000s and the great uniter, Barack Obama, came around. So I think that's a huge data point.
Did you see the chart that I had up?
I'm not seeing anything besides you and I on the screen.
Okay. Because I had it up there under the share, because oh my gosh, I had it under the share the entire screen, and I put it up there, but then it's not showing it, and I don't know why. Again, you guys will have to bear with me as I learn this studio.
I should get my guy Christian on a phone call with you and I, so he can teach us all this stuff. He spent a lot of time with the Rumble developers over the last year, so he kind of knows the
that
ins
would
and
be
outs.
awesome.
Yeah, I'll see if I can set that up. I
Okay.
owe him a phone call anyways.
Okay. So over to BCCI. So we're gonna talk today specifically about the criminal enterprise. So we basically have spent talking about the money laundering convictions, the background of the banks, the background of the officials that kind of turned their head in the federal government over the last few shows. But I wanted to start off, I'm going to read something, which is incredibly, it sets the foundation of what we're going to talk about today, because it's crazy. You guys remember that we mentioned that the Kerry subcommittee John Kerry subcommittee, when he was a freshman senator, looked into the CIA and their activities. And many people believe that it was kind of a limited hangout thing because of his role in several things afterwards. But there is a lot of interesting information that he uncovered during his investigation. So it says the Kerry subcommittee relations with the CIA were nearly as bad as they had been with the Department of Justice. Both agencies had known for years about BCCI and were hard-pressed to explain anything. After Kerry badgered the agencies for several months for a briefing on the relationship between BCCI and the CIA, they finally agreed to a meeting. Listen to these names. The problem was that the person sent to speak with Kerry's staff member, Jonathan Weiner, and David McKean were junior officers and knew nothing about the questions that Kerry had. Jonathan Weiner, where do we know that name from?
Relatively familiar. Did he pop up quite a few times during Russiagate?
Yes, he did.
Uh-huh.
He going back, he didn't even know who Kamal Adam was. He didn't know anything about the accounts with BCCI. He didn't know anything about BCCI. He didn't even seem to know why they were there. Weiner's response, "No, you guys screwed yourself," when John Kerry said to them, "You look like you guys just got screwed." Meanwhile, Kerry, so I found it interesting that Jonathan Weiner was in the CIA.
If it's the same Jonathan Weiner, didn't I run across it? He's teaching journalism at Columbia at this point in time.
It was all in his, up to his ears in Russiagate. And he was working at the CIA. Very interesting. Meanwhile, Kerry continued to press the CIA director, William Webster, for CIA reports on BCCI. Finally, on July 23rd, came the first break. Webster admitted in a letter to Kerry that the existence of two documents, both of which he described as extremely sensitive. When Kerry reviewed them in private, he was astounded to find that one of them, dated in 1986, reported that BCCI secretly owned First American. It was referred to as the Mulholland Memo, would not turn up until several months later. He obtained permission to declassify it and show it to Virgil Mattingly at the Fed, who, according to Kerry staffers, expressed shock that the CIA, Treasury, State, and Office of the Comptroller of the Currency had possessed this information in 1986 and never provided it to the Federal Reserve. The CIA itself finally went public when Director Richard Kerr announced at the National Press Club on August 2nd, they love that date, before an uncritical audience of high school students who were not allowed to ask questions, that the CIA did have a normal operational account at BCCI themselves. Weiner's comment that the CIA had screwed themselves was not far from the truth, as it would soon happen. John Kerry is nothing if not persistent, and he was the most dangerous to his adversaries on the BCCI case when he believed that he had been slighted or taken advantage of. About this time, George Bush nominated Robert Gates for director of the CIA. The nomination had been thrown into question in July when Al Fiers, former head of the CIA's Latin American Task Force, had pled guilty to 2 counts of lying to Congress about where high officials at the CIA first learned about the illegal diversions during the Iran-Contra scandal. This raised new questions what Gates himself, who had been deputy director, knew about the Iran-Contra. Kerry finally saw his opportunity. He told the CIA that unless he got cooperation, the Gates memo would be put on permanent hold. Gates' nomination would be put on permanent hold. Under the Senate's procedural rules, a single senator had that ability. Okay, replied the CIA. We'll get you another briefing, a better one. No, said Kerry. He would be satisfied with nothing less than public testimony of Richard Kerr. And so Kerr, greatly against his will, was brought before the Kerry subcommittee in October of 1991. And keep in mind, this is all happening after we declared war and were going into Desert Storm. And right, so that's all 1991. I was deployed to Iraq from January to July, and this is happening in October. So it's all being overshadowed by another war, always. Kerr admitted both that the CIA had known for years that about BCCI and the fact that they had maintained accounts there. Yet another story from the Office of Comptroller of the Currency showed again just how much had been covered up. One of the more striking parts of the Mulholland CIA story was that CIA information on BCCI's secret ownership of First American had been given directly to the second-ranking officer in the Comptroller of Currency. His name is Robert Bench. This meant that in 1985, during the Reagan administration, it had reached what was, along with the Federal Reserve, the very core of banking regulation in the United States. Yet this was not the first time that the Office of the Currency had heard about BCCI, nor was it the first time that Bench had been given a detailed report on the bank. And here again is the tale of documents that disappeared and were later covered up. In early 1978, Joseph Vaez, V-A-E-Z, a bank examiner at the Comptroller's office, or the currency, was sent out with a team of auditors to look at the books of what was then the largest bank in the world, Bank of America. The man who sent him out and who later received his report was Robert Bench. Vaez's assignment was to evaluate the bank's 6-year-old investment in 30% of the shares of BCCI. The memo he wrote to his superiors was the regulator's first objective glimpse into the world of the fast-growing multinational bank, into what Abedi and his cohorts had really been up to since the middle 70s, 72. Writing in the determinant Language of a bank examiner. Viez rolled out a description of a bank that was, even by the go-go standards of those years, when the sudden crash of the petrodollar deposits in the third world lending were straining bank balances around the world, dangerously out of control. The Viez memo provided the OCC with a horrifyingly detailed summary of the bank that within a decade would boast a huge presence in the United States. What happened at the OCC? When the Senate investigators probed, the OCC claimed that it had lost the memo. Then, when Viez graciously agreed in 1990 to send the OCC a copy that he kept, the OCC refused to let the investigators have it. It came to light only after the force of a congressional subpoena. The weird odyssey of Viez's report was the first of many instances of reports of BCCI that were mysteriously buried. What's your comments on that?
Oh, there's a whole lot to unpack there. Yeah, the first one I want to touch on is B of A. And I think it's an important thing to note is Bank of America is not your traditional Wall Street bank. They were headquartered in North Carolina. They didn't really become part of the Wall Street Club officially until they swallowed up Merrill Lynch in the wake of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and Merrill had to get all their mortgage-backed books, all that stuff off their books. So Bank of America was an outsider from the traditional banking powers in America. The other bank in that category that's still around is Wells Fargo as a West Coast bank. But they weren't part of the old boys club, so they played a little bit different rules. So I thought that was interesting. But the pattern you just described is over and over again. We've got institutional ignorance that obviously is not accidental, and their ability. You worked in the government. I've worked in banks. Pieces of paper do not disappear. There are backups and redundancies to all this stuff. Something does not disappear unless it is made to disappear.
Yeah, things disappeared, but that's because that was a verb as opposed to being misplaced.
Yeah, it does not happen. Especially even more so in government and banking, there is a paper trail of the paper trail of the paper trail.
Okay, so let me add the cherry to the top. The man who directly received the report, Viez's supervisor at the time, was Robert Bench. Later, he becomes a partner in Price Waterhouse. Now, do you know Price Waterhouse is the auditor of every single CIA bank in the world? Every single bank, Nugent Hand, Castle Bank, BCCI's, that Price Waterhouse was their auditor. And generally, in every case that I've investigated, within a few months, in Castle Bank, I think it was like 3 months, there was a audit done on the record that said they were perfectly fine. And then they went bankrupt.
We've got a lot of examples of that. It's interesting that Price Waterhouse Coopers survived all that. And they used to be the big 5 accounting firms. Now it's the big 4 or the big 3. And that's because of, what's her name that went down with Enron? Exact same story. A lot of the connected partners.
Anderson Cooper, what Price? No, yeah, whatever.
I'm drawing a blank on it. Yes, thank you. And they had given Enron. Well, I bring up the Enron because, well, as we talked about last week, there's all kinds of connections to the Houston Mafia, the oil mafia around the world, into the same banking world. I guess none of it happens without they get their bill of health from their 5-star auditors, who just apparently will give they'll give the clean bill of health to just about anybody until they have to, until they get called to the carpet.
So it also says that it was Bench who in 1989 was assigned to supervise Price Waterhouse's client relationship with BCCI in the U.S. and to help the bank comply with U.S. banking rules in the wake of the Tampa indictment. It says the Drug Enforcement Administration not only sat in on the meetings, but had 120 cases in its file, mostly linking BCCI with undercover storefront money laundering operations. The DEA agents in storefronts all over the country knew as a matter of course that BCCI is the place to launder money. And it says that the report that was given to Kerry eventually said, it argued that the most shocking failure to follow up occurred at the IRS. Most startling, this is a quote, is the IRS's refusal to begin an undercover investigation of BCCI despite persistent requests from the Criminal Investigation Division personnel. The IRS had identified over 15 major matters involving BCCI from 1984 to 1991. And just some of them, because I think this is important, and one of them is actually a shocker, and you'll know why. In 86, India had given the IRS documentation showing a multi-million-dollar laundering scheme with BCCI at the center. No action was taken. 1987, the IRS received a criminal referral from the Fed regarding cash transactions and irregular activities in BCCI's Miami and Atlanta accounts. Nothing was done. In 1988, the IRS brought a major money laundering case against defendant Jerry Lee Harvey. $60 million was laundered, much of it through BCCI Panama and Cayman Islands. Nothing was done. In 1989, in Oklahoma City, the IRS, which was in the Oklahoma building that blew up, indicted and convicted a heroin dealer who had laundered over $1 million through BCCI's New York and Hong Kong offices. No follow-up. In 1989, the IRS office in Dallas requested and was refused permission to expand an investigation to Miami after a large undercover operation had fingered its key link in money laundering activities to BCCI.
It fits the pattern. The question that comes up to my mind is, obviously you have some people, some straight shooters at the IRS are doing their job and they're forwarding their reports up the food chain. Somehow that reaches a decision maker at the IRS and they make a decision to proceed or not to proceed. What they're doing at the time is they're conferring with their counterparts at other government agencies who would be stakeholders in such an investigation, whether it be the OCC, DOJ, what have you. Somebody is giving a stand down order. And that's what we talked about last week. Who's in a position to give those final orders and what are their connections? Did they have incentives? If I could take a step back, you talk about the, about money laundering and these accounting, basically the fully audited banks. And somehow they pass an audit, yet they're doing everything dirty as all heck. We find out 2 years later. So I haven't been through a few bank audits. Banks have very, very strict rules. And, even you go down to the branch level, they follow, everything is followed like a ritual. You just don't, every I's dotted and T's crossed. And it's across every single bank, about the same rules apply. And some comply, letter to the letter of the law, and some, fall off a little bit for certain reasons we can get into. The bottom line is every dollar that gets transacted through a commercial or a consumer bank, there's a paper trail to it. And even at the bank teller level, you are trained from day one how to spot certain patterns of anti-money laundering traits. The big one, of course, is deposits of cash greater than $10,000 or any deposit of that. Or if there's a series of deposits. Now, every single bank also has something called KYC rules, know your customer, which means you've got to know where the money came from. You have to ask these questions. If you don't know, you forward it up the chain of command to somebody who's a little more savvy and experienced. But you do have to know where the money comes from. The point being, these always have a paper trail. And one of the things that, is an economy as big as ours, the federal government and the regulators, they rely an awful lot on data analysis, which is specifically designed to spot these, patterns of excessive deposits that don't appear to have any normal viable business. And then they also, they track the withdrawals. So for it to have shown up on the IRS radar is not entirely unusual. For it not to have shown up on other radars is surprising. But at the end of the day, the patterns were always going to be there. It's very hard for them not to be, which makes it's pretty hard to conclude anything other than someone is turning a blind eye on purpose.
Correct. And that kind of was my takeaway from this. Part of that is that multiple people in the IRS, the DEA, the DOJ, all knew about BCCI. We talked last week about the and also the currency, the comptroller of the currency. And yeah, all of those people knew. They knew for like 10 or more years.
So someone in chat, Mayor Sarge in the Rumble chat, says suspicious transaction report. And let me just address that real quickly. We call them SARS, suspicious activity report. And that's basically anything over $10,000 you're filling out a form. There's several other things that would trigger a suspicious activity report. That's done at the branch level. We're talking about a retail branch. You're not talking about millions of dollars very often. You're talking about more of a hub bank that's dealing in that international business. You get a lot more SARS. Having filled these things out myself, the last thing you want to do is to have to fill out at the branch level or the even higher level. The last thing you want to be doing is filling out a suspicious activity report, but you have to do it. You're hoping it gets filed and goes away because of the incentive structure in the banking system. You don't want to lose a customer who's depositing money. Most of your bonuses, even from the teller level all the way up to regional managers, the entire banking system is based on an incentive system of, for example, you have your nice, friendly personal banker. It's a good entry-level job out of college. They may or may not know anything about finance. It's hit or miss. They're usually, pretty honest, well-meaning people. Well, they don't have a choice. They have to give 5 referrals, for example, of a home equity line of credit every single week for them to make their bonuses. And that goes across to the branch level and to the regional level, all the way on up. So you've created a perverse set of incentives so people do not want their customers to get reported and have to lose the account. So, and that's a problem I observed firsthand when I worked for the Wall Street banks, is they had a perverse incentive structure. I mean, you should be compensated on how well you take care of your customers, but that's really hard to set up into a regulatory environment. So the problem isn't just top down, it's bottom up. Everybody involved in the chain has an incentive to not have these people not get caught or not be revealed to be doing money laundering.
Good to know. I wanted to talk today about, since we've got Bank of America on the radar, I wanted to go into just a little bit of depth. And do you know anything about the origins of Bank of America, where it came from?
Well, I know they were headquartered out in North Carolina before. I read something recently, but once you start talking, I'm going to remember it.
So, well, through various like a roundabout way, I had asked my husband, because he does a lot of the like day trading and financial stuff like that, to just look into that. Its origin was an Italian bank that eventually made its way to the United States. And because it was not getting any traction in the United States using its Italian name, that it changed its name to Bank of America and kind of started as, like you inferred, an outsider to the big industrial complex of banking in the United States. So it's interesting that, at the time that this was going on in the 80s and 90s, that and late 70s, that Bank of America, let me just disclose how they got involved. So let's see, as far back as 1978, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the largest U.S. regulator of banks, had run its own audit on BCCI as part of a larger audit of Bank of America, which revealed at the time in 1978 that Bank of America held 30% of BCCI's shares. The conclusion of the audit, which along with all of the other early warning signs of BCCI's condition, was made to disappear, which we were just talking about. The bank's explosive growth had created strains on its management. The bank had no lending limits, often had no documentation at all supporting its loans, and it was whizzing money around the world from affiliate to affiliate and leaving no paper trails. Money was disappearing into unsecured burrows, into a holding company called the International Credit and Investment Company, that was located in the Cayman Islands. Now, this one's going to come up a couple of times, but that holding company was supposedly where all of they had like 10,000 employees. All of their retirement accounts and everything was there. And they used, just like the mafia up in Chicago with the Teamsters and all of those, they use, I don't know if you've done any research on that, but they use the pension funds of all of the union people to fund themselves in all of these different operations. So this is basically the model that BCCI was using. They took their employees' pension fund, put it all in this. The acronym for it is ICIC in the Cayman Islands. And then anytime that they were in a crunch, they would go to that account to bail themselves out. So when they went bankrupt, that account was basically gone. And keep in mind that the original findings, when they did get around to looking at BCCI, the couple of times that they did, was that the only real asset that it had was a couple of days of the float of all of the Pakistanis that were used all over the Middle East as day laborers. So just like we used to have the people that came up as day laborers from the South, and they sent all the remittance home, the Pakistanis, there was like 3 million of them distributed throughout all of the Middle East, and they all would send remittance back. And Abedi had a relationship with the government of Pakistan that those remittance, he was like the vendor of choice for the government. And all those remittance came through the branch in Pakistan of BCCI. And so he had that float, which was tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars on any given day.
It's interesting. You mentioned the Cayman Islands. Have you been to the Caymans yourself?
No.
I have on a number of scuba diving trips, and before 2016, I was actually considered going expat myself, and Caymans were one of the places I was looking at going. Wonderful scuba diving. But, we've talked about it. Everyone knows the Cayman Islands is a banking mecca of the world. Well, the entire banking system in the Cayman Islands is about 2 blocks by 2 blocks, with none of the buildings being more than 3 stories high. It is a tiny little part of a tiny downtown. Literally a block and a half away is where the cruise ships let people out to do their day tour events. So you've got all these billions of dollars going through this tiny little island, which is a tax haven. Funny story about that. We'll do another time. But if you look at this downtown, and it does not look anything like Wall Street or the City of London or even Hong Kong. It's a bunch of tiny little 2- and 3-story buildings with maybe 5 to 10 people doing office, shuffling papers. It is basically just an outpost for money to come into and come out of it, and then to basically hide any kind of tracing, trying to make it harder to track where those funds go. But this is not a giant megalopolis by any stretch. They do have quite a few in the suburbs. You can't throw a rock without hitting an English law firm. There are an awful lot of them, and they exist just to set up trusts, other shell type of entities for people that are trying to bring money into the Cayman Islands. And it is very, very British. Absolutely, I would say the majority of the people in that industry are from England. And but it's interesting. It is not what you would think it would be.
And so not lost on the audience here is the fact that we know BCCI was ran out of the City of London and the Cayman Islands.
Mm-hmm.
So
but you're not going to find any decision makers in the Caymans. That's just an entity.
Correct.
It's all on paper. Everything
Correct.
in the Caymans. So,
but it is a great place to hide money.
Yeah, it most certainly was. There's a what's the other island I'm trying to remember? Nauru. Have you run into that in any of this stuff? Nauru is Nauru, and it's a tiny island near Australia that in the 1980s, tell me if this sounds familiar, became a banking laundering haven for the Russian mob and Al-Qaeda. Before the country imposed tougher laws, it's estimated that at least $70 billion in Russian mob money flowed through Nauru in a single year. One more sentence on this.
Isn't that when Nugent Han was down there?
Yeah, we're at about the same time there, right? 1980s.
Yeah.
At one time, Nauru's privacy protections were even stronger than those in the notorious offshore money haven Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, making the tiny nation all the more attractive for criminals looking to conceal cash.
Huh. Well, that's very interesting. I'm going to have to look into that one. Okay. So back when Abedi, the guy that is credited with setting up BCCI, he worked at a bank called United Bank before he set up BCCI. He had a friend there at United Bank that was Dutch, and his name is Dick Van Owen. It's spelled Oenen. He was the local representative and best friend of Abedi. He worked for Bank of America in Karachi. And it was, he also had an office in Abedi's United Bank building. They were best buds. In the early 1970s, Bank of America was the largest bank in the world, and its ambitious chairman, A.W. Tom Clausen, was fairly drooling at the prospect of opening up a bank in the Middle East. And it was this Van Owen that decided to take Abedi to the United States to sell the concept to the Bank of America management, that they basically make an investment, and it says in exchange, Bank of America would take a 30% share in the new bank for $626,000 and a seat on the board. Complete control of the day-to-day affairs was given to Abedi. Is that crazy?
Well, the Dutch connection is interesting because we haven't dove into that too much. But anytime we start talking about all the international banking scandals and the history of it, the Netherlands was a prominent player.
Oh, yes.
The dual entry banking system was invented in Venice by the De Medicis. And Venice was a dominant mercantilist player in the world for a couple of centuries. They would then move their operations, same people, some of the same families through marriage. And the Netherlands became the banking hub of the world for near a century, back in the days of the Dutch East India Company. That would be supplanted by England and, of course, the British East India Company and the modern banking system as we know it today. But the Dutch remain one of the central hubs of international banking, and that was one of the main conduits to where Wall Street money, the Prescott-Bush coalition, was funneling money into the Nazi Party before in the build-up to World War II. This is through Brown Brothers. Harriman would create shell companies that implicates Prescott-Bush and a number of other people in this. But so I always suspect you're going to see a Dutch connection in these banking.
Always.
It's going to be there. They are still a major player.
So we're also going to talk a little bit about the arms deal in the second part of the show. So I want to make this connection for you. When BCCI was created in and called a Pakistani bank, it was actually when Ali Boutros came to power in Pakistan, it was banned from even doing business in Pakistan. The other guys around that was installed in Pakistan loved it, but Boutros actually kicked Abedi out of the country and said, you can't do that crap here. So I found that very interesting. Anyway, and of course, that's when he registered it and incorporated it in Luxembourg and then set up the office in London. So, also.
So this is back in 72 when they're first getting started, you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, interesting. I did not have that data point.
So in the 1980s, BCCI at that point was one of the most successful, depending on how you define successful, by amount of money. I don't know that it allegedly had, because it didn't really actually even have money, but whatever. Every 2 weeks, a new BCCI branch was opened somewhere in the world, and more than $1 billion in new assets were being added each year. Though Western banking authorities resolutely refused to let Abedi into the club, He was basically operating everywhere else. And an increasingly nervous Bank of America had sold its equity at this point. It's 30%.
What year are we in now?
1980s. Abeti had built the world's first third world, quote unquote, bank. And it says he claimed not to own a single share of his own creation. And there's a whole story about how they basically did the shares because it was circuitous. So, for example, like, a lot of people set up a company and then they'll set up another company, and this company will serve as the registered agent for this company, and this company serves as a registered agent for this company. That's how Abeti did all of the shares.
Yeah, it's a concept called a bank holding company, and we start talking about these shells within shells within shells is exactly what you're describing. But if you look, you'll find an awful lot of the major banks are bank holding companies, and the bank itself is a subsidiary. That's still common to this day.
So it says here that at this point is when all of the UAE and the Saudis all kind of get in bed with Abeti. And it says, and we talked about the former head of the Saudi intelligence, by the late 1970s, BCCI had effectively merged with a guy by the name of Zayed's private department, which basically is UAE. And the private department is basically like covert operations of them, and they handled all of the oil money. And it was very secret. Most people didn't know anything about what they invested in or anything else. And so you can kind of see the melding of the separation between this banking entity and these governments going away. Further on the Bank of America, it says that once Abeti had gotten control of the National Bank of Georgia, which we explained last week how that happened. Abeti reconfigured it along the lines of his own bank. In 1979, shortly after one of Abeti's partners had bought up the remaining stock, Abeti summoned to his London office both Farone and a man by the name of Roy P.M. Carlson. Carlson was the Bank of America executive who had set up the bank's purchase of 30% back in 1972. So, same guy that helped them create basically what I refer to as a CIA front bank called BCCI. And what would that be? 72. So 7 years later, gets summoned to appear before Abeti. Carlson had entertained Abeti when he came to the U.S. on multiple trips, and the two had become best friends. They remained in contact when, in 75, Carlson left Bank of America to become president of Rahim Irvani giant Milani Group in Iran.
Nice connections there.
Abeti and Irvani were close associates and partners in the bank Abeti started in Iran, called Iran Arab Bank. Now, again, this is in the 70s, before the overthrow of the Shah.
That's exactly what I was thinking. The timing is interesting.
Very interesting, isn't it? So basically, we installed the Shah. Iran's a hotbed for CIA activities, to include after the overthrow, because we were basically selling weapons to Iran during the 1980s as well. Oh, and by the way, who financed all those weapon deals that we did with Iran? BCCI. They provided money Israel was the cutout for shipping those weapons, the actual Stinger missiles, into Iran. those were shipped out of Israel, and BCCI was the financing arm of all of this.
And we can't have that conversation without pointing out that President George H.W. Bush was running the CIA during the mid to late 70s for a couple of years.
100%.
Let me bring another connection to the 70s and 80s for you, because, just since we're talking about banking, they're getting all these deposits, illicit and otherwise, in BCCI and other banks, apparently. Banks exist not just to sit on that cash, but they actually make money by lending the money out. We've talked about how a lot of this money goes into real estate. Well, a nice little sleight of hand also happened in the 70s, 80s, and that's when Fannie Mae, a quasi-government agency, comes into play and start creating what's called mortgage-backed pass-through securities, Fannie Mae's and Freddie Mac's, where basically they would guarantee the loans being made by dirty banks and basically washing the money through the federal government and paying out private shareholders who purchase these mortgage-backed securities. But here you have a quasi-government agency that created an entire new facility to help facilitate the laundering of that money. Because once it's been lent out and it comes back in the form of an interest payment, it is squeaky clean. Yeah, and that's how these banks make money for themselves and their customers. They don't just take the deposits and sit on them. At the same time, you've already talked about the litany of fake loans they made to their own directors. Some of them are forgiven, some of them never paid any interest on at all. But that's one of the things BCCI got in trouble for, was lending money to its own directors.
Well, all of these banks do that. Nugent Hand was doing it, all of them, and they're all not secured loans. That's how they money launder. They never intend to get the money back.
When Fannie Mae started doing their pass-through loans, when that got approved, who was the president of the United States in 1981 through 90 when that all happened?
Oh, gosh, that would be Reagan and Bush.
And Bush.
So Betty had lined up Irvani to be one of his front men in the Financial General acquisition. To complete the circle, Irvani and Carlson, who we were just talking about, were also partners in the former CIA director Richard Helms' consulting firm, Safeer, Safeer, which he had started after leaving his post as the U.S. ambassador to Iran.
Yeah, fun connection.
Is that crazy? So it says the three men chatted in Betty's office, remembering old times, shaking their head at the terrible events that had happened in Iran that cost Betty his bank and Carlson his job in Tehran. Then came the moment for which Carlson had been summoned. Ferrone offered him the top job at the National Bank of Georgia.
We talked about the country Georgia, right?
No, I'm talking about the Atlanta bank that held Jimmy Carter's loans.
That one. Okay. Was that National Bank of Georgia? Why did I have another name for it on that? Did it switch names during this time period once or twice?
I don't know, but Carlson became the head of the bank that had Jimmy Carter's loans. You just can't make this shit up.
Well, it's almost enough. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist at all to see all these connections and start to ask them serious questions. Is there a whole network of people in and outside of government allowing this to happen, playing by a separate set of rules? And to not ask that question, you have to be naive.
I think unequivocally that's true. And also getting back to Clifford and Altman, the guys that kind of ran BCCI, or they were the face of it inside the United States, which we talked about in the first show. It was discovered during the minority report of the House Banking Committee that Clifford and Altman had not disclosed an $18 million loan that they loaned to themselves from BCCI's banks that they were officers of. Similarly, their actions as lawyers for BCCI over the years suggested that they knew of the real relationship between the banks in the United States. Altman had blocked damaging memoranda on BCCI from Bank of America as far back as 1978. In 1988, he and Clifford orchestrated the $20 million defense of BCCI in Tampa, which included lobbying hard against a RICO charge. When Kerry's subcommittee began investigating BCCI that same year, Altman was alleged by Amjan Awan and Ali Marja, the two kind of whistleblowers in the case, to have told Awan to flee the country. Kerry's staff believed that Altman deliberately stonewalled their query, denying the existence of documents in BCCI's U.S. offices relating to Manuel Noriega, for example, when it later came out that such documents had been there all along. It's, again, I can't. It's just so crazy.
I'm thinking about our friend that we featured a couple of weeks ago, Bert Lance, and he's got to be right in the middle of that little triangle that you're talking about there. With
absolutely. Okay, so I want to get to some of the weapons trafficking that occurred. There was a Pakistani general by the name of Haq, H-A-Q. I'm not exactly sure how they also refer to him as Zia, which is also part of his name. He becomes president of Pakistan. Well, hold on. There's two different people here. The Pakistani general named Haq, and then there's President Zia. So when Zia was president of Pakistan, the U.S. basically pretended that they didn't know anything about Haq and his activities, because he was the guy that was the arms supplier to the Afghan rebels that were being smuggled in through his district into Afghanistan. And Haq was also running the drug trade out of Afghanistan. So he's running weapons in and drugs out. BCCI was involved in that entire operation by floating loans on both sides. He would buy the drugs from the Afghan warlords, get them shipped out, and he was financing the arms into that.
Well, let's not forget where the arms came through, because that's where the Israeli Mossad gets involved in this.
Yeah, and the CIA. I mean,
yeah. Well, the U.S. couldn't directly send the arms. That would have been considered an act of war, similar to what we're doing in Ukraine right now. But apparently, those norms no longer apply.
Right.
We involved the Israelis as a third party to help facilitate that. Now, when I say the Israelis, I mean the Israeli intelligence.
Okay, so it said Zia, the general, ends up getting killed. And it says that he was basically the protectorate of all of they had set up all kinds of heroin refining labs in Pakistan for the heroin being taken out of Afghanistan, which is why the CIA really had a presence there. It had nothing to do with them tricking the Soviets into the war into Afghanistan. It was so they could set up this entire operation. So that's just one of many. I'm going to go through a few examples that is talked about in here about their involvement in the weapons trafficking. Let's see. There's another weapons deal that involved the UAE and let's see, and Saudi Arabia, and also Jordan. And this was, I was trying to look for the date of this one. This one had to have been in the 90s because they're talking about the operations there. And it said that there were $6 million worth of weapons that were basically skimmed off of the weapons for Desert Storm. And they were funneled through things like the Abu Dhabi Investment Fund and their central bank. And it also mentions, which it goes into a lot more in depth later on in the book, this thing they referred to as the Black Network, which was the oil money and all of the illicit arms sales. Because, you know, the U.S. and the military aid and the State Department aid, a lot of that goes to equipping the Middle East with armament. And a lot of that ends up on the black market.
There's a step involved in that that's worth going into, because you talk about U.S. foreign aid. Well, a big chunk of that comes from USAID.
Yes.
And they don't just show up with a big check for a government, say, hand it out. What they do is they deposit in a local bank. Best example I can give you, the most recent one that's really glaring, is Privat Bank in Ukraine. All of this USAID money, it goes in a Privat Bank. Well, that's owned by a oligarch in Ukraine. It was owned by a guy named Ihor Kolomoisky. Kolomoisky was Zelensky's sponsor when he ran for president. The whole reason he wanted Zelensky in there is because he wanted to get his bank back. But once his monies are deposited, the reason Kolomoisky lost his bank is he wasn't giving out loans to everywhere where he was supposed to. He did some oil and gas loans like he's supposed to, but a lot of that money ended up being funneled through loans to himself and his own directors at different shell companies. Then get filtered out through Cyprus, which is what they used, and then into United States real estate. That's where this USAID money goes. Anytime we're giving foreign aid to a country, it's being deposited in a local bank. Theoretically, that's been vetted by our State Department, but you and I both know what that means.
Right. Well, and interestingly enough, from a Gladio perspective, Ihor Kolomoisky was appointed a governor after the 2014 coup in Ukraine. And he immediately hired the Azov battalion for his security of his governorship. And that governorship entity, as far as landmass, just happens to border the Donbass region, where all of the Azov battalion Nazis were conducting Operation Gladio assassinations of 11 mayors in the Donbass region and blowing up buildings and doing all kinds of things that very similarly look like Gladio operations out of the province that Ihor Kolomoisky was the governor of. And then recently, like 3 months ago, the New York Times puts that paper out, that article that actually acknowledges the fact that the CIA came in and established basically what you would refer to as stay behind units throughout the eastern seaboard, or not seaboard, the eastern border of the Donbass region, but not in the Donbass region. And originally we were told that those CIA things were there to thwart Russia. Well, then why didn't you actually put them in the Donbass region? Because that was the region that bordered Russia. So if they were actually for Ukraine's security from Russia, you'd have put them in the Donbass region, but you didn't. You put them in what borderlined the Donbass region because you were going to use them to covertly attack the Donbass region because they all voted the wrong way.
And it's no coincidence that the largest offshore center of CIA, most manpower they have, is right next door in Poland. And that's basically the shit. Yeah.
You mean where we just opened a new military base for the first time in decades?
It's purely coincidental, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
But the point being that our taxpayer dollars are being funneled through the State Department and programs like the USAID directly into these paramilitary and other illicit activities. And there's a direct paper trail in some places, but it wasn't just done in Ukraine. This is exactly the story you're telling of, foreign aid, and it's got to go. That has to go to a banking entity. Governments are not set up to distribute.
So, back to your comment about Israel's role in this. One of the whistleblowers that was working with the reporters exposing BCCI says that he knew from his reporting experience that Israel would work with anyone who furthered Israeli goals. And it was true that Mossad had been an influential presence in Panama, which was a key transshipment point for clandestine weapons deals. He also knew that there had been something of a quiet scandal within the U.S. law enforcement circles over BCCI documents related to Noriega that had apparently disappeared. How did anyone know? Well, and this informant they referred to as Sammy. Sammy, tell me more about Mossad. Quote, what do you want to know? We trained together in Karachi, Pakistan, for covert operations. We gathered information for Mossad, spying on the Gulf states because they were so close to the ruling families there that we were familiar with their foreign policies. The Israelis sold U.S. arms, technology, expertise to Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, and BCCI brokered all of the deals. BCCI would loan money to the countries for the purchases, but some of that came back to Pakistan as a gift. Galeth Farone was involved in 50 Scud B that North Korea sold to Syria. BCCI didn't finance that deal. They paid for it upon instruction. They gave the Mossad Israel the use of their agents in the Emirate. BCCI was friends to everybody. And then he goes on to say about working with the CIA that they did joint operations. BCCI was financing Israeli arms going into Afghanistan. There were Israeli arms, Israeli planes, and CIA pilots. Arms were coming into Afghanistan, and we were facilitating it all. So, again, they knew all about this. And it was 100% a criminal enterprise. Money laundering was almost a side job for the bank. What they were really there for was the money laundering and facilitating arms deals. Now, in one place in here, and I'm not going to read the exact words, but a lot of these deals were set up at meetings at BCCI branches. So these arms dealers would fly in and they would meet at these secured facilities that supposedly were BCCI banks. Well, when they had large meetings of multiple, I think the guy said something like anything over like 10 people, they would fly in minors to service the people coming in for the meetings. So this bank was actively involved in human trafficking. And anybody that went to any of the meetings that had anything to do with that bank knew that what activity was going on.
It was that openly flagrant.
That openly flagrant. It was like almost being served hors d'oeuvres at a social in the evening. You were given your pick.
And who is it that perfected that technique that's been in the headlines quite a bit the last decade in America?
Well, I don't know that he perfected it because that's an age-old thing. But he definitely was actively involved in it.
I just brought that up because it's, once again, we have the Mossad connection to all of that.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and interestingly enough, you have, speaking of which, because I was just talking about this, Robert Maxwell, who sold the promised software that supposedly, according to Inslaw, the manufacturer of it, would allow for the exposure of anyone trying to money launder. That was one of the parts of that system. But by creating back doors to it, you are able to expose other people's money laundering and hide your own. And so basically the Department of Justice steals that software from Inslaw. CIA ends up with a copy of it, and so does Mossad. And Robert Maxwell is famous for going around the world selling the Mossad version of the software to all these different countries, banking institutes, thinking that they were going to be able to finally get money laundering under control, when in fact it just gave the intel agencies insight into who was doing the money laundering for blackmail purposes, and to be able to hide their own money laundering so no one else could find it. And then mysteriously, Robert Maxwell ends up falling off of a boat off the coast of the Canary Islands, which is really weird because do you know where Operation Gladio scuba diving and water mining and all that other stuff was the training for that was conducted? On the Canary Islands. And he just mysteriously pulls his boat up there and falls off.
Yeah, that's one of those other coincidences. Now, you mentioned the interesting thing about the Promise software and the backdoor into you can see everyone else's. I talked last week about Edwin Meese's connection to the DALITE, D-A-L-I-T-E, which is a district attorney automated legal information system, which is the kissing cousin of Promise.
Which is very similar.
So is it fair to speculate of whether they basically set up a system where they would have a backdoor into all of the, every district attorney's office? They could tell where every prosecution's coming from. And did that go higher than just district attorneys?
No. I mean, not no to did it go higher. Any of that software that is deployed in critical nodes of blackmailable information 1000% has an intelligence agency backdoor. 100%.
Why start with having all the banking information? We can also have everything that the prosecutors are doing from the other end. You're going to know
exactly.
You're going to know everything that's going on, not only to see what the other guys are doing, but to make sure that nobody's ever sniffing your trail.
Correct.
Yeah. So yeah, you just triggered the next step of that investigation for me. I'm going to spend some more time on DALITE to find out if there's anything more there.
Yeah, that's an astute observation right there. That's probably huge. You might want to have your computer in private mode when you're doing that. Just saying.
Oh, I've already. Okay. I work under the assumption that anybody wants to, they're reading everything I ever type, text, or say.
Every single thing, absolutely. Okay, so moving on. I want to get to this one scandal where there's so many trying to decide which of the like for example here BCCI was implicated in the Pakistani drug trade, and the BCCI was orchestrating weapons deals with a guy whose name is Masihur, Masihur Rahman. Rahman, sorry. Rahman. He was another one of the arms dealers that BCCI financed. There's also so when they started talking about the plea bargain of the case in Tampa, there was also action pending against the bank, like in that was never mentioned in anything. There was Bogota, Colombia, Lagos, Lagos, and several other BCCI branches were being investigated for intelligence operations, drug and weapon sales, and other unusual activities. And none of that information, even though the Department of Justice knew it, was made available or used in the prosecution in Tampa. So, hold on just a second. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to, my little sticker thing that I had sticking in there is not there now. I had a color-coded one, but I know what it is off the top of my head. I want to get to this part because part of the weapons trafficking that BCCI was doing was, what is I'm trying to think of the technical term. I won't know what it is. it's the trigger or the igniter that sets off the nuclear bomb. So we're just going to call it a trigger. The part is a very highly secured, highly unavailable because of the significance of it. BCCI sold Pakistan that equipment that allowed their nuclear program to go live.
What year is this?
Go ahead.
What year?
I don't remember the year off the top of my head. That was probably the most significant weapons deal that I have found associated with BCCI, because without BCCI's involvement in it, and Khashoggi was involved in that deal, the
Adnan.
Yeah. So Pakistan's entire, nuclear program, and there's a lot of people, just from the stuff that I've read in like the Covert magazine, and there's a lot of people that speculate that Pakistan basically functions as a satellite of the CIA in the form of a country. That's the whole reason it was set up after World War II. The circumstances that allowed for it to become a nuclear power, basically you had to get India nuclear in order to then justify Pakistan going nuclear. You had to stage a war between the two that then, you know what I mean? So there's like this long process of this evolutionary strategy of tension, which Gladio is notorious for, in order to there to be the capability of having nuclear power within the control. And you can argue, if you go back and look at the manipulation of what the CIA did to the Pakistani government, anybody that ever got in there that actually cared about the Pakistani people was immediately murdered. And they almost always had a strong man, generally educated in the West, brought up through the military, that then stepped into the void of the assassinated prime minister. And a lot of people today say that's why they hate Khan, because he is one of those nationalists that is not owned by the West.
Yeah, I think it's very much the case. And we most certainly cooed Khan. It had all the classic hallmarks. Yeah. And I wanted to get a little bit more insight from you on that, because I've read about this anecdotally, but you've probably experienced it firsthand. It's not just Pakistan, but all over the world, you've got countries like this where their military comes to the United States to learn from our Pentagon. At the same time, you talk about all these arms dealers, and where do these arms get manufactured? And that's where it ties into our military-industrial complex, and you see these same generals from the Pentagon end up on the board of directors of the Raytheons and everyone like that here in America. And it's not just an American story, because you've got huge French military industrial contractors, as well as a couple of other countries. But these arms aren't. Where was that?
Sweden.
I didn't have Sweden on that list. I did not know that.
Sweden's military industrial complex is huge.
And these people have a vested interest in making sure that there's a market for these arms, and therefore
strategy of tension.
Exactly.
And all of it was set up after World War II in the boundaries, creating the perpetual war machine.
Well, I think, yeah, this is one of the interesting questions Mike Benz brings up when he's pointing, Mike Benz touches on pretty much everything from 1990 onwards. He doesn't go back as far as we do most of the time, although I'm sure he's got the knowledge. But he goes, look, I haven't answered the question. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? I bring this up because it's post-World War II. The Great Depression was devastating throughout the world. And we did not get out of the Great Depression until we basically nationalized our economy to become a war machine. Once the war is over in 1945, America's got to make a choice. Either we completely pull back that manufacturing, or we go back into a depression, which is what would have happened, especially with 6 or 8 million, GIs coming back home. So they had to keep the industry going, which is why they started the World Bank and the IMF to create loans to rebuild other countries so they could purchase no longer our weapon systems, but the same factories started turning into making consumer goods. That was the shift. So the question is, was that a good thing? Was it necessary? No, but what we're talking about is the tactics that were used, and they were definitely unconstitutional, dishonest with the American public and the world, and basically a breach of trust. So they will justify it. You know, if they're ever put on trial, this mysterious they behind all this, the puppet masters, they'll say, "Look, America's stronger because of it," and it's a interesting argument. But
Well, if you go back to why we got into World War II to begin with, you know, I can make the argument that if you go back to the Fabian Society and the one world government, we got into World War II in order to perpetuate the trek into one world government. Because after a world war, I have the ability, once I win the world war, in order to redefine the world. And I redefined the world in order to perpetuate a war machine that I can use for selective ethnic cleansing, which is what it's been used for. And I don't care what anybody says. And I have heard Mike Ben say that, and every time he does, it's like nails on a chalkboard. Because if anyone thinks that ethnic cleansing is okay for any reason at all, you're off your rocker. And this isn't just about our servicemen going over there into a war machine, which he's never been a part of, by the way. It is also cleaning out the interior of the Amazon and of all of the indigenous Indian tribes that happened after World War II. It's cleaning out all of Latin America of anyone that even had a remote leaning towards being a nationalist and loving their country. Every one of them were slaughtered. And I don't care how much of a depression we have to go through or a recession in the United States, if it means not murdering people, mass murder. Millions of people have died as a result of this machine. And under no circumstances is that okay. None.
no, it's morally bankrupt. But in any way, straight form, it's the American empire, and it's not for the sake of the American empire. They justify it, you know, based on we've got to save democracy. You know, we've got to do it for our national interests. We've got to do it, you know, for our national security. Well, you know, that worked during the Cold War to some degree, when they had a monopoly on the news channels. You know, they were able to sell us on this whole red menace. They've had to switch gears since the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's the same, as you've demonstrated ad nauseum. It's the exact same tactics over and over and over again. The patterns never change. They just had to come up with new justifications.
And their justification after the 1991, of course, was the rise of Islamic terrorism, which they created themselves. And so then you go back and you go, well, if you're willing to create an entire industry of terrorism, did you create the image of the communist threat? Which, of course, as you and I talked last time, I do in fact believe that the majority of that was manufactured. That's not denying that there wasn't communist people around, but the actual threat of its spread and of its ability to affect life in America, grossly over exaggerated.
Yeah, and if they say that this group is a bunch of pro-democracy freedom fighters, they can have anything they want from our tax, coffers, and this other group that might be nationalists and want to keep their resources for their own country, they obviously have to be evil dictators and has to be overthrown.
And the real travesty of all of this to me is not a single government that I've looked into hated America. Not a single government didn't want to do business with us. They wanted business done in a fair deal. They wanted, like Lumumba, he came to Eisenhower. Eisenhower refused to meet with him. He met with Richard Nixon, and all he wanted was to substitute Belgium's cut of the pie of Congolese uranium. They wanted to cut Belgium out, who had colonized them for 350 freaking years, and cut off their hands when they didn't harvest enough uranium for them. Cut them out, sell it all 100% to the United States with them getting Belgium's cut. And the US government told them no. That's bullshit. That's bullshit on any level. They did the same thing in Chile. They did the same thing in Nicaragua. Every one of them wanted their cake and eat it too. And I'll go one step further. Mattei, I think that's how you pronounce his name. Enrique Mattei, I believe is his name. The guy that was in charge of the Italian, like large natural gas and energy state-owned entity in Italy, flew to Algeria and was talking to Algeria about a new concession to supply Italy oil, natural gas, one of those two, and said that we want to change the thing up to give us 50-50 because we want to be fair to you. No one in the world was okay with that. The BP people was not okay with that. No one in Texas was okay with that. None of the international syndicate was okay with this crazy Italian going over there and actually recognizing the fact that they own their own resources and you should be more fair with them. They blew up the man's airplane and killed him. So originally, because they owned everybody in Italy, they classified that as an air accident. You know, after Operation Gladio got exposed, there was a lot of questions about what happened to that guy. They went back and exhumed his body and found bomb fragments in his ring. And they classified his assassination as an assassination. And there were people that eventually was held accountable. That was part of Operation Gladio because they all work for the international syndicate. And you are not allowed to make deals that are not approved by them.
Fun stuff. Yeah,
it's crazy. On. And then for somebody to say, well, is that bad or is that good? I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to do a small little 20-minute video last week about, about that Cheney endorsement and just talk about how one guy, the one who used to be called the Prince of Darkness, has been involved in so many of these things going back 30 or 40, 3 or 4 decades, even more than that. It's the Prince of Darkness. Now he's endorsing Kamala Harris. Well, no, he's not endorsing Kamala Harris. He's endorsing someone who's part of the Uniparty, who's ready to continue to perpetuate this. You see our politicians fly over to places like Ukraine, etc., and literally months later, the bombs start flying every single time, and that's why
every single time.
Yeah, that's why it's so important to expose this stuff, because the way our Constitution is written, the executive branch is supposed to control our foreign policy, not the other way around. And right now, the quote-unquote blob, or the international syndicate, or the people who really call the shots for their own purposes, not for those of the American people, who just, ostensibly as a nation, we just want to live in peace and trade with our neighbors. That's what our government should be setting up. Anything else, they are basically betraying their oaths of office.
Absolutely. And if we can't compete fairly, then we shouldn't be competing.
Agreed. And that's why the tariff idea actually makes a ton of sense. And no, it's not going to import inflation. Small degree. There is some economic validity.
So SR-71, my great researcher, Enrico Mattei is the guy's name. Thank you, SR-71, for backing me up on that. I was pretty sure that was his name.
He also gave us Pakistan became a nuclear power in 1998. No.
98. Okay. So
that was officially, but they were. Do we know whether they actually had?
But that is. Yeah. That is consistent with, because all of the nuclear deals was made under Clinton, with as far as the exchanging. Because again, what I found most fascinating about that whole thing was the weapon triggers, whatever you call them, going over there because of the whole move behind Bill Clinton and his dealings with the drug networks in Arkansas, with the money laundering that was going on there. I mean, it just kind of like one little happy family there.
Yeah, Mena, Arkansas. I mean, we can do a series of shows on Mena, Arkansas. Yeah, I did a video when I first got started doing this stuff called talking about the Bush Clinton crime families, where I didn't go anywhere near deep enough into the Clintons, but there's so much there.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think we've done a decent skimming of the surface of the BCCI being much bigger than just a bank that did money laundering. It was a crime scene that involved human trafficking, weapons trafficking, drug trafficking, along with the enabler of money laundering.
Yeah, and as we've seen so many times, they got nothing but a slap on the wrist, you know, and it's what happens with these banks. We didn't get a chance to get into it today, but we've got TD Bank going, making headlines over the last month, once again with money laundering, paying a $1.9 billion fine, and yet we see hundreds of billions of dollars of illicit gains were made. And it is just a slap on the wrist, and the real players never, ever face prosecution. And we saw that with HSBC. There's a whole litany of these companies that walked away with a fine.
Well, here's what I think is very interesting about the TD one, though, is in the immediate aftermath of the announcement. So my first gut reaction was, why are the criminals never held accountable that were actually doing the money laundering? Well, then within a few days, I had to like bite my tongue because there were two takedowns of two large drug networks. And if you think about it, you do have to prove the money laundering piece of that. And while you're investigating the money laundering piece of that, you're going to discover the networks. Now, in the past, as you point out, rightly so, they knew who the network was. They just never followed up in exposing it, right? Because Jeffrey Epstein money laundered. I mean, that was the whole purpose of his operation. So why wasn't any of that ever exposed? And why wasn't any person held accountable? But the following week after the TD announcement, there was two major drug kingpins that were arrested. And I don't remember their names off the top of my head, but that was like the light clicking on going, oh crap. That's the whole purpose of now coming out with the money laundering. Just as we're having the election to bring Trump back in, you now have the network's money all tracked everywhere. You know where the money originated from. You've got all of the suspicious activity reports reporting all of this activity. Now all you have to do is go back to the origins and you can bring the entire network down.
Yeah, let's hope that happens. Earlier in your chat, someone mentioned the fact that these people operate a lot like pirates. Well, there's a reason for those similarities, and I'll just close up with my final quote. The difference between piracy and a privateer is a piece of paper that says it's legitimate, and that's what basically we've done. Is we've launched an entire horde of pirates. People go in there to loot and plunder other places, bribe, cajole, and other things as well. And we give them the legitimacy of the U.S. government or the United Nations or whatever body decides to do that. But their actions are no different. And every once in a while, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I didn't know you weren't friends.
Okay, every once in a while, someone's going to have to walk the plank, but it's never the captain.
Well,
or rarely.
Because I'm going to tell you about a story. I did a video, I think it's on my Substack, about the Bush family, which you mentioned earlier, Prescott Bush. If you go back on the Walker side of their family, like 6 generations, that man was a privateer for the crown as a ship captain that happened to transport slaves. He was a slave ship captain. And he was so evil that on his last cruise, his ship people mutinied and murdered him and threw him overboard.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because it's going to segue into what we keep hinting at. We're going to do Skull and Bones. And there's no coincidence that Skull and Bones is also the pirate flag. And I'll just say right now, the money that's established the Skull and Bones Foundation came from an opium smuggling family. We'll talk about the Rockefellers. Well, Rockefeller's father was an opium dealer. And
Absolutely.
there's all these opium connections going back to the 1800s over and over and over again. We are ruled by pirates in many, many ways.
Well, and if you think about Operation Gladio, the entire thing being paramilitary is just the incorporation of it into our government.
Yeah, and it's about being above the law and outside the law, and that's how piracy works. You can do whatever you want, and if you can get a letter of marque and become a privateer and never change your behavior, you're still a pirate.
And what we did was move that letter into a government salary position in the CIA.
Bingo.
They're all pirates.
Well, that's a good segue. We will get to Skull and Bones soon and really dive into that, but today was fun.
I agree. Thank you for being here. Hope everybody enjoyed this. We will be live at 4:00 on our spaces and on X, and I hope to see everybody there. Thank you again for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Till next time.